God wants you to marry your rapist? Well, hello again. Welcome to another video. Today we are looking at a Bible passage that is alarming to many people. And the inspiration, I guess I'll say, for this video came out of a conversation I had a while back with a young lady regarding this passage of scripture. And she was an unbeliever. She was an atheist, and she was, I'll say, quite clear that she thought this passage of the Bible was horrendous, and she thought it reflected on a God who was horrendous in terms of his callous handling and attitude toward young women. So the passage we are talking about is found in Deuteronomy chapter 22. This is, of course, part of the Old Testament law. And Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 and 29, I will read the passage and then we can talk about it. So, beginning verse 28 reads, "If a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and has sexual relations with her, and they are discovered, then the man who had sexual relations with her shall give the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her. He is not allowed to divorce her all his days." Now, at face value, I will concede that this sounds terrible, right? This sounds like the worst idea ever. That by God's law, by God's word, the way to handle the outfall of a rape is to force the victim of the rape to marry the rapist. That sounds horrendous. But what I want to do today is I want to look at what this passage is actually teaching, and I want to try to better understand some of the context behind this passage, and so ultimately that we might see the heart of God in this text. The first thing that I will say is that for a lot of people, certainly for the young lady that I had this conversation with, the actual will and purpose and nature of God, I'll say, are certainly not what she thinks. So let's leave it there as far as preliminaries go, and get into the text itself. The very first thing that I want to say about this passage, and I've talked about this many times in the videos on this channel, is that, of course, this passage here in the book of Deuteronomy is a law passage. It is a part of the law written to Old Testament Israel. And I bring that up because there is a common misconception in the unbelieving world that there is this dichotomy of Christians, that essentially there are two kinds of Christians. There are, keeping in mind this passage that we just read, there are the Christians that think that rapists, or rape victims rather, should be forced to marry their rapists. And then there are the other kind of Christians that just ignore the Bible when they don't like what it says. And this is a very, very common view in the unbelieving world, right? That either you think all this stuff should come about, or option B, you disregard the Bible when it's not convenient for you. And so in a lot of the teaching videos that we do on this channel, we try really hard to explain the reality behind that this passage is not written to the present day church. This passage is written to Old Testament Israel. As I said, this is in the book of Deuteronomy. Um, it's a part of the Old Testament law. And if we go in the Bible to the beginning of the Old Testament law, it's found in the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 19. And this is the beginning of the narrative of God giving the Old Testament law to Israel through Moses. So this is Exodus chapter 19, and I'll begin reading in verse 3. So this is God speaking here. Exodus 19, verse 3. This is what you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So again, this is where we read about God giving the Old Testament law to people, I'll say. And this passage is very, very clear that God is giving this law to Israel as a part of a covenant between God and Israel. And so this was part of a covenant, and that covenant would last until Jesus came and fulfilled it. So this covenant encompassed the entire Old Testament law. And the passage that we read from in Deuteronomy was a part of that law. In fact, the word Deuteronomy literally means second law. So the very first argument that I want to bring up here is that it needs to be understood. You know, people will point to the present day Christian church, and they'll point to this Deuteronomy passage, and they'll say, well, do you think that this is what we should be doing? No, I think that's what Israel should have been doing in the past when they were living under the Old Testament law. And that's just reading the text of the law within the context that it was given. To say that this should apply to the Christian church in 2021 is to take the command of the law and just lift it out of the context of the law and apply it into a different context, right? It would be no different than if we were to look at the law of Sweden and take one of the tenets of Swedish law and just kind of cut that out, copy paste it, and drop it into the law of the land where you happen to live. It would be equally invalid, right? You can't just take the command and throw it into another context. It's just not valid. So I want that understood just up front, that this is a part of the Old Testament law. It doesn't apply to the church today. But I, in all fairness, I would say that if we acknowledge that a first reading of this passage is disturbing, and I think I was clear that it certainly can appear disturbing at first reading, I think it's fair to acknowledge that moving it just to a command written to Old Testament Israel doesn't really fully address the issue, right? I mean, certainly for the young lady that I was talking to, as I said, she thought that this command was just horrendous, and she thought the presence of the command testified to a horrendous God. So if you say as an argument, well, it doesn't apply to us today, that was in the past, well, from her point of view, well, so what? All you've really done is you've said your horrendous God isn't horrendous today, but he used to be. That's not really a sound argument. And I have heard that taught as an argument. I just don't think it goes nearly far enough to address what's going on with this passage. Just isolating it to a specific culture and a specific time in history, it's valid in terms of understanding the application of the passage. But we need to dig deeper, I think. Certainly, if people are going to jump to conclusions about the nature of God in reading this passage. So, in terms of understanding, we talked about the context. The other things that we should talk about regarding the context of this passage, and this honestly goes, I would say, beyond just Israel and Old Testament. This is more like ancient Near East culture. Um, the first thing that we should understand around the historical culture of this passage is that in this time and a place, virginity for a young woman was a huge deal. Like in for us in 2021, if a girl gets married and she happens to not be a virgin, um, that doesn't seem to be, a deal at all, right? It's just the way it is. It's just 2021. It's just our culture. Um, and I guess I could kind of branch off into a rant into a rant about declining moral standards, but it's really not particularly relevant to this or to understanding, I guess, this passage. But the point to note is that at in the place and at the time when this passage was written, virginity was hugely important for a young woman. And in the circumstance of a rape being committed, from a cultural standpoint, you might hope that people would be merciful and look past the fact that the woman was only a victim. You might hope for that kind of forgiveness in terms of attitude, but to be realistic, you may not see it. Um, and that's not something that you would pin on the Bible, because this was a cultural thing, not a biblical thing. So if you were to say, well, that's a problem with the culture, right? Why can't guys have a better attitude when women have just been victims? Amen. I completely agree. They can have a better attitude. They should have a better attitude. But I'm just talking about in the historical culture to which this passage was written. Um, a young woman who was not a virgin would be looked upon very differently in society. And though it's a sad truth, I think it's a truth nonetheless. The fact that she may not have voluntarily chosen to lose her virginity perhaps might not make as much difference as we might hope. And again, I'm just painting a picture of the culture here, of how things were perceived. The second point I would say about culture, and it's directly related to the first, is that in this time and place, there was, of course, there was no welfare system, there was no social support. And that's related because, from a social perspective, living in Old Testament Israel, women were dependent on men to make a living. Women were not allowed to work independently. They were not allowed to own land independently. And so all of this matters because if a young woman is not a virgin, she's going to be perceived differently in the culture. She's probably going to have a tough time finding a husband because she's not a virgin. Um, and given that there was no welfare, there was no kind of social assistance programs, this could be a circumstance that was literally life-threatening for a woman, right? If she's not a virgin and she can't find a husband, she can't work, she can't own a business, she can't own land, essentially she is reduced to begging for mercy just to stay alive. And so, of course, when we consider this in the context of rape, certainly nobody is minimizing the impact of rape on a woman. That's absolutely not the point. But for a woman in this culture, it could get even worse in the sense that a rape could turn into a death sentence. Or, if not a death sentence, a life sentence, right? Because she could be ostracized, she could be bound to extreme poverty for the entirety of her life, as an outflow from that one event that may have happened when she was a young woman. And again, here, I want to make it clear I'm not only referring to Israelite culture. This is not just a product of the Old Testament written to Israel. This was the entire culture across the region in this time. In many, many ways, the culture within Israel was actually better than that of surrounding nations on account of some of the things written into the Old Testament law. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But this is just a picture of the culture in the region and the potential impact, the potential danger that could come from a woman being raped. Now, the next thing that I want to say about culture is in regard to the culture of men and women getting married. So, if and when men and women did get married, the way it worked in this culture was that the family of the bride went to the family of the groom. One of the interesting things that took place in this culture is that the sense of a marriage today just is a lot more focused around just bride and groom. Like this guy is getting married to this girl, and that's the way that we perceive a marriage, a wedding. Uh, in the Old Testament Near East culture, it was seen as much broader than that, and it was seen as bringing together two families. And so, in this culture, when a wedding was planned, the family of the bride would go talk to the family of the groom, and they would negotiate what was called a bride price. Now, we need to be clear when we talk about a bride price, this was a price that the groom's family would pay for the bride. But again, I want to be clear here that this was not seen as a purchasing of the bride. I've heard it pejoratively expressed that way, that you know the groom goes somewhere and he purchases his wife and on he goes. I want to be clear that when the bride's family and the groom's family get together for this negotiation, if there was any talk from the groom or his family about purchasing a wife, those negotiations would be over, and you would be very, very abruptly shown the door. You're not purchasing a wife, and to suggest in any way that that's what's going on would be profoundly disrespectful. It would be entirely disrespectful and unacceptable. The perception of the bride price was that, again, part of the culture was when the bride and the groom got married, the bride would leave her family and go live with the groom, who usually would reside with his family. So you have a bride leaving her family and going to live with the family of her new husband. And so the perception of this bride price was that the type of work that people would usually do in this day and age, families were usually agrarian in nature. They would grow crops, they would farm, they would raise livestock, and so on and so forth. So the perception of the bride price was firstly that the bride's family were losing the labor of the bride from the farmland that they were working. So they're going to lose the value of her labor. but it was also seen as a way of bestowing honor on the bride's family. And it was to the extent honor was such an important part of this negotiation that the negotiation itself was somewhat of a loaded process, because you would want to go negotiate a bride price. You don't want to pay an astronomical price, but at the end of the day, also, you would typically go in with a generous price, because if you negotiate too hard or try to push the price down too low, again, there's that sense of, if you cross a line, you're going to be asked to leave. Because if you go in and you lowball a price, that again, that would just be seen as disrespectful to the bride and disrespectful to the family of the bride. So there was this bride price negotiation here, but honor and respect to the bride and her family was a fundamental part of that negotiation. It was intertwined all the way through it. Now, the last thing that I'll say on culture, because some people read passages like this from the Old Testament and they will come away with a conclusion that they'll say, in the Old Testament, women were of so little value that rape wasn't even seen as a big deal, right? That a man could just go and take a woman and rape her if he decided like he wanted to, and then having raped the woman, if he wanted to, he could just go ahead and marry her. And, basically he could do whatever he wanted. There were no social norms or cultural nuances to inhibit whatever he feels like in any possible way. That basically that society was just kind of indifferent to the rights of women, up to and including the crime of rape. Well, in response to that, I would point to Genesis chapter 34, in which we see an example of a rape in the Old Testament. So, Genesis chapter 34, verse 1 reads, "Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. When Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her and lay with her and raped her." So this is a young girl named Dinah, a daughter of Jacob, and she is raped by this man Shechem. But amazing though it may seem, Shechem actually finds a way to compound his crime, to actually make things even worse. Because Shechem rapes Dinah, and then down in verse 12 here, he approaches the family and he says, demand of me. Do we want to read 12? Okay, let's back up to 8. So verse 8, Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage." So having raped her, they're now approaching the family to negotiate a marriage. "And intermarry with us, and give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. So you will live with us, and the land shall be open to you. Live and trade in it, and acquire property in it." Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "Let me find favor in your sight, and I will give whatever you tell me. Demand of me ever so much bridal payment and gift, and I'll give you whatever you tell me, but give me the girl in marriage." So, to capture what's going on here, remember what we talked about before about the bride price being an essential part of the negotiation when a husband would take his wife. The other thing that we should have talked about there is that there's a bit of a sense of the bride price that it might be seen a little bit like a birthday gift or a Christmas gift or something like that. That the onus is supposed to fall on the family of the groom to bring forth some sort of bride price as a starting point, right? Like there may be some sort of negotiation along the way, but you don't start out at zero. Right? If you start out at zero, you literally have nothing to talk about. You've just disrespected the family. So as I said before, remember there's a lot of honor attached to this. And so, as I said, Shechem actually, believe it or not, finds a way to compound his crime of rape and make it even worse because he takes Jacob's daughter and rapes her. And then he goes to the family and says, you know what? I've been thinking about it. I think I'd actually like to take her as my wife. But I haven't bothered to sit down and come up with an offer of a bride price. Why don't you just throw a number at me and I'll pay it? Like essentially what he's saying, it's important to catch this in terms of the culture. He's having raped her, having taken away her virginity, he then goes to her family and he's kind of saying to them, let's be honest, guys. I mean, I'm kind of bargain shopping here, right? Because we both know, like, she's damaged goods, right? I'm not exactly like shopping for the top aisle here. Like that is the sense of how he approaches the family. He has the audacity to rape her and then has the audacity to attack her integrity and by extension the integrity of her family because she's not a virgin because he raped her, right? It's just it'd be one of those moments where Jacob and the brothers are hearing this and they're like, really, really, dude. Okay, all right. And you see how that message is received because all the way down in verse 25, it says, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came upon the city undetected and killed every male. So what do Dinah's brothers do in response to this rape? They go down to the city where Shechem is and they murder everybody. Now, I want to be super clear here that this was not an appropriate response, right? This is one of those situations that if we're trying to figure out who's right and who's wrong, everybody's wrong in this story, that nobody is right. I mean, I guess you could say Dinah didn't do anything wrong. She was the victim of this. But so what the brothers did was vigilante justice. It was not appropriate. It was not lawful by any stretch. But I want to bring up this passage just to speak to that perception that I talked about before, that there was somehow an indifference toward rape in the Old Testament. Clearly, there wasn't indifference. These guys just massacred an entire city full of people on the account of what was done to their sister. It clearly was not tolerated. But now let's jump back to the Deuteronomy text here. That's a little too far. That's better. And I want to look at what this passage is actually teaching, given what we have talked about us with the culture. So the first thing I would say about this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 22, and again, I think this speaks to the value that God has for women and speaks specifically against the idea of indifference toward rape, is I would point out that here in Deuteronomy 22, this clause around marriage is reserved only for single women only. What happens if a man rapes a married woman? We see in verse 25 here. 25, if the man finds the girl who is betrothed in the field, and the man seizes her and rapes her, then only the man who raped her shall die. So again, if we're going to listen to this narrative, um, this idea about indifference toward rape, well, here in the exact same passage in Deuteronomy chapter 22, the text is entirely clear and unequivocal that under the Old Testament law, if you rape a married woman, you are put to death. And that's it, right? It's not unclear. It doesn't beat around the bush. That's what happens. Indifference toward rape? I don't think so. They had the death penalty for rapists. But back to the passage again, 28 and 29. If a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and has sexual relations with her and they are discovered, then the man who had sexual relations with her shall give the girl's father, 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her. And sorry, my screen jumped here. And he is not allowed to divorce her all his days. Well, the next thing I want to talk about here from a point of clarity is to talk about what law is. Because understanding this passage correctly requires that we understand what law does and what it doesn't do. So law, at its nature, by its definition, law codifies behaviors that are not allowed, and for those behaviors that are not allowed, it prescribes penalties for those who are guilty of breaking it. What the law doesn't do, and it's super important that we grasp this point in order that we understand this passage, what the law does not do is prescribe penalties for victims of law breaking. Let me give you an analogy. Let's pretend that you commit an act of theft against me. Let's imagine you steal $1,000 from me, and the case goes to court and you're found guilty, and perhaps you're prescribed some kind of punishment that you have to go through as a result of your act of theft, and perhaps as part of the restitution for the crime that you committed, you have to pay back to me the $1,000 that you took in the first place. So let's imagine you write a check or whatever. You write me a check for $1,000 and it gets handed to the judge, or I don't know how this would all work. Eventually, the check winds up in my hands. But let's imagine that I'm feeling really merciful and really forgiving, and let's imagine during the course of the court case, you talk about your life and you've talked about all the hard times that you've endured and how you're just trying to get on your feet and blah, 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 blah. You have a lot of debts and you have this and that. And let's imagine I'm feeling really charitable, I'm feeling really forgiving and merciful, and I decide, no, you know what? I want to give you a break in life. I want you to get on your feet financially. I want you to keep that $1,000. But the court ruled that you pay it back to me, so I've got this check from you in my hand. Well, here's the thing. The law obligates you to repay the money. The law doesn't obligate me to cash the check, because I'm not under that theft law, because I didn't commit theft, right? The obligation is on you as the one guilty of stealing. Like, the punishment applies to you to pay me back the money. But I can do whatever I please. I can cash the check, keep the money. I can cash the check, I can give the money away. I can tear up the check. right? The point being, regardless of what the law says that you have to do because you're guilty of theft, I don't have to do anything. I'm completely free, right? The law does not take away from my liberty in any way, shape, or form because I was the victim of a crime. That's not what law does. And so, in the context of this passage, we need to understand that the law was working the same way in regard to marriage. What the law was doing was obligating the the rapist, the man. He was under obligation to marry the wife, but she's not under obligation to marry him. So the way that this was supposed to work was that this obligation on the man to take her as a wife, this was essentially like a social assistance program, a welfare program. As we talked about at the beginning, um, a woman who was not a virgin could be in danger of starving to death in this culture. So this passage is written in the law as a means of avoiding that, right? That if she runs the risk of falling on hard times to the extent that her life might be in danger, well, she does have this obligation written under the law to require her rapist to take her as a wife, and at that point, he would be obligated to provide for her. It doesn't mean that she would have to like put on an apron and cook him supper. It means that he would be under obligation to provide for her, to provide her with enough money to live, to provide her with food to eat. So it's a way of preventing her from being a victim over and over and over again. But as I said before, the obligation was not on the woman to marry the man. The obligation was on the man to marry the woman if she so desired. And you might say, well, who would desire? Well, as I said before, the only person that would realistically desire this is it's as a means of avoiding starving to death. Now, as we talked about before, we talked about the negotiation between bride's family and groom's family. In 99.9999% of cases, I would imagine both the woman and the father would have no interest in a rapist marrying his victim. And so the rapist would be required to pay a price of 50 shekels. Now, that 50 shekels, again, obviously, it's not, it doesn't make up for what was taken away, but that 50 shekels was the equivalent to about 5 years worth of labor. In present day standards, let's assume an average salary of, say, $50,000 a year, you're talking about $250,000 of payment to the victim's family for the crime of rape. Again, it certainly doesn't erase what happened. It certainly doesn't make it okay, but it does put the victim in a position where she can put food on the table for the foreseeable future without having to be concerned about her own welfare, about how are we going to eat if I can't find a husband. It gave her a degree of financial protection given the culture that she lived in. That was the purpose of this law. That was the intent of it. It was there, again, not to detract from the liberty of the woman, but to provide her some degree of safety and security within this culture. Now, the last thing that I want to say is it still doesn't feel great right? We can understand this law better, and we can see that the law didn't set out to victimize or to mistreat rape victims. That was not the intent of the law. But you still don't get a great feeling from reading this text. Certainly, the young lady that I had a conversation with, she wasn't into it at all. She was like, "Well, it's still disgusting. It's still awful," and that's an important point because, as I said to her, we're not supposed to feel good about this. Like, it's important to understand the text of the Bible. It's important to understand the text of the law. But even in 2021, rape laws are awful. Rape trials are awful, right? We hear on the news about people that have been accused of rape, and we hear about the trials that are going on in the courtrooms, and then somebody is found guilty and they are sentenced, and the court case is over. Well, people don't walk out of the courtroom high-fiving, right? Because even in the appropriate and correct um, finding of guilt of someone that genuinely committed such a crime, still nobody feels great. Nobody says, "Wow, that was amazing. That was amazing." Like, that guy clearly was guilty, and we brought all of the weight of our legal system to bear, and he was found guilty, and now he's going to go to jail. Man, I love this legal system. I love this country, right? Nobody ever says that, because always after a trial of this nature, after a court case of this nature, we're always still left with that sense that there's only so much we can do through a legal system, right? We can, at the very most, we can take the life of the rapist. We can remove liberties in some creative ways. We can offer provision for the victim, but law can't give back what was taken. And we all recognize that, right? I mean, how many times have we heard about rape cases? We've talked about rape cases, and you talk about the sentencing, and you say it just doesn't seem right, right? I mean, you take away so much, you do that much fundamental damage to someone, and it just doesn't seem right. And that's what I was trying to get across, that when we read this passage of the Old Testament and it still doesn't really feel great to us, well, I don't think it's supposed to. I don't think it's supposed to, because what we're reading about are rape laws in the Old Testament. It's not supposed to make us feel good, right? This is one of these Bible passages that, you know how some people take their favorite Bible verse and they get them embroidered and then they frame it and hang it up on the wall. If you get this passage of the Bible embroidered, you're weird, right? This is talking about rape laws. It's not supposed to be a good picture. It's not supposed to make us feel good. It's supposed to care for the victim, which it does, and it's supposed to offer a penalty for the accused, which it does. Is it enough? Well, I don't know. In fact, I would lean towards saying, no, it's never going to be enough. In fact, the fact that these laws are captured in the Old Testament, in a way, is a great picture that we can understand why Jesus Christ had to come. Because as we read passages like this in the Old Testament, it becomes clear to us, if it wasn't already clear, that humans governing other humans doesn't really cut it. Humans governing humans requires that we write laws like this about what to do when somebody gets raped. Even when God is the author of the laws, and so you can say that the specifics of the law in terms of handling the victim and in terms of handling the accused, you could say that the specifics of the law are perfect because they were written by the hand of God, but ultimately when you take those perfect written laws and you apply them to human society, again, you get a mess. You get a giant mess where, again, anti-rape laws are required, right? It just doesn't cut it. And that much is clear from the existence of the law itself, but not just from the existence of the law, but from the entire narrative of the history of Israel, right? You see messes like this all through the Old Testament, and you see them before the law was written in books like Exodus and books like Deuteronomy, but you also see a giant mess after the law was written. So what we learn is that written law doesn't fix sinful humanity. And that was the reason why Jesus Christ had to come into the world, to offer a response to the sinfulness of humanity. Written law never would do it, never has done it, never will do it. What we need is Jesus Christ. So that to me is what I see through this passage in the Bible. I hope it's been useful for you. I hope, as I said at the beginning, you can see a little bit of the heart of God here in this passage. It certainly is not the way that many people point to this passage as grossly unjust and grossly indifferent to the circumstances of women. The Bible upholds the value of women consistently, and it calls upon us as followers of God to do the same. So I thank you again for watching. If you found this interesting, we have a lot of videos now on this channel. We actually have a whole series titled "Who Knew?" and in that series, we look at a whole series of Bible passages that are often mistaken or misunderstood, misinterpreted, misapplied, and we try to offer a legitimate perspective, a Christian perspective, a perspective that aims to teach and explain the Bible in an accurate way. Thank you again for watching. Hope you're doing well. God bless.